"Marrying an orphan substitute before the season is done," he said. Maud laid 2 gloved fingers across her name before the nib could touch paper. Through the open doors, Geoffrey waited beneath white wedding flowers in a dark navy coat, while his mother and female relations stared at the ivory-clad bride as if the mistake had already been made. "Then His Grace may regret what I actually agree to," Maud said. "Not what you agree to for me. Give me every page." The solicitor held a thick packet of parchment tied with cream ribbon. Anthony kept the pen poised. "The guests are waiting. Your sister abandoned her duty. You offered to repair the arrangement, and now you would delay the bishop over a formality. It is my name." Geoffrey crossed the threshold but left the double doors open. The wedding salon remained visible behind him. Gilded panels, white roses, and a room full of witnesses suddenly silent. "Can anyone here give Miss Talbot's assent for her 'Know Your Grace'?" the solicitor said. "She is of age. These articles require her own signature." "Granville, step away." Anthony began to protest. "Step away." The pen went down. "Give her the pages," Geoffrey said. The cream ribbon whispered over parchment. Maud read the separate use provision, then the jointure that would protect her if she were widowed. Her eyes stopped at the final addition, a 1-season residence clause. "Whose choice is this? His Grace's protection," Anthony said. "If this hasty marriage proves unworkable—" Maud looked only at the solicitor. "The choice is yours," he said. "After 1 season, you may decide whether to continue residing at Penhallow or establish the separate residence provided for in the settlement. The marriage itself is not dissolved by the clause." There it was. Geoffrey had not bought himself an easy escape from an inconvenient bride. He had accepted a season in which her residence at Penhallow could not be presumed permanent. Maud took up the pen and signed. Geoffrey watched the ink settle. Then it is executed. The paper was settled. The harder question waited beyond the open doors. Would his family treat her choice as real after the ceremony, or merely as an inconvenience they meant to outlast? Geoffrey offered his arm. Maud lifted her bouquet of white roses and placed her gloved hand lightly on his navy sleeve. He neither drew her closer nor hurried her. They entered the wedding salon together. 3 of Geoffrey's female relations stood most plainly to the left, shock and disapproval written across their faces. Older men and wedding guests watched from behind them. Geoffrey did not shield Maud from their scrutiny. He simply stood where the bridegroom belonged. The bishop resumed the service. When the vows had been spoken and the register attended to, Maud Talbot was no longer an orphan relation standing in for an absent sister. She was Maud, Duchess of Penhallow, because she had chosen to sign her own name. Before Maud went to change her gown, Anthony caught Geoffrey in the corridor. Maud had paused near the library door and heard him plainly. "You have done your duty to the title," Anthony said, "but you have given a stranger an extraordinary freedom. When the season ends, she will use it against you." "The clause is exactly what she signed," Geoffrey replied. "It is her right. She is the lesser Talbot. She is merely standing in. You cannot mean to let a bride for 1 season dictate the terms of Penhallow." Geoffrey turned toward the library. "Abbot." The solicitor appeared at once. "Inform the household that no one is to address my wife by her sister's name, nor call her a replacement stand-in or substitute. She is Maud, Duchess of Penhallow. A servant who forgets may seek another place. A relation who forgets will not be received." Anthony's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. Geoffrey walked on without looking back. Maud remained beside the library door, the weight of her wedding silk settling around her ankles. Anthony had mistaken a right to choose her residence for Geoffrey's escape from an unwanted wife. Geoffrey had not made that mistake. The question now was whether the house would learn the difference between tolerating Maud and making room for her. By the middle of the first week, the protections on parchment had met the habits of Penhallow. Maud needed a room. Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper, waited at the head of the grand staircase with a heavy ring of keys. "Your Grace, I have not yet received orders concerning the principal suite. The late Duchess's rooms have been preserved since her death. We assumed you would take them." Maud looked down the west corridor. The double doors remained shut. No one had said she must become the former Duchess, yet the whole house seemed prepared to place her where that woman had slept and call the matter settled. Geoffrey came up the stairs carrying a leather folio. He followed Maud's gaze. "The suite remains as it is," he told Mrs. Hale. Then he looked at Maud. "Unless you ask for it to be opened." He had not barred the room to her. He had also not assigned it to her. "I do not require those rooms," Maud said. "Where is the east morning room?" Mrs. Hale blinked. "Much smaller, Your Grace. It catches the early sun, but at present it holds spare furniture and some old ledgers." "Show me." The east room overlooked the winter garden. A smaller dressing room adjoined it, and the old schoolroom lay beyond. Dust silvered the unused tables. Chairs had been stacked along one wall, yet nothing in the room asked Maud to resemble the dead or the sister who had fled. "Clear it," Geoffrey said. "Have the furniture removed." "Wait." He stopped. "Leave the writing table by the window and those 2 armchairs. The rest may go." Geoffrey glanced at the plain table, then at Mrs. Hale. "Her Grace's instruction stands." A young footman appeared in the doorway before Mrs. Hale could leave. "Your Grace, shall we bring the late Duchess's escritoire from the west suite?" Maud looked at the modest writing table by the window. "No. My writing case and books may come here. The escritoire stays where it is." Geoffrey made no amendment. For the first time since Maud had entered Penhallow, the household had to prepare a duchess's room from her own possessions rather than from the remains of someone else's life. When the housekeeper went to find footman, Geoffrey drew the brass key from the lock. Held it out. Maud took it. The metal was cold in her palm. "If you want anything brought from the principal suite, say so. My own things will be sufficient." He nodded and left her in the morning light. Maud closed her fingers around the key. What unsettled her was not gratitude, but attraction. Geoffrey could have rearranged every room in the house with a sentence. Instead, when she named the place she wanted, he changed his own order and left the choice untouched. The room was smaller than the ducal suite, and more valuable to her. For that reason, no absent woman had occupied it first. A room and a key did not alter the rest of Penhallow. By the second week, Maud could see how many of its routines still served people who no longer lived there. Breakfast proved it. On Tuesday of the second week, Maud woke early. She dressed and walked down to the state dining room. A heavy silver bell rang through the corridors at exactly 7 o'clock. Maud found the dining room empty of diners but fully staffed. 4 footmen stood at attention. A massive silver tea service dominated the long mahogany table. The chair at the head of the table was empty. Geoffrey's chair was set to the right. A chair for the Duchess was set at the far end 20 feet away. Maud watched a footman walk the entire length of the room simply to place a single spoon near the distant chair. Geoffrey entered a moment later. He wore a dark morning coat holding a stack of estate correspondence. He sat in his designated chair. He looked up expecting Maud to walk to the far end of the room. Maud did not move toward the distant chair. She looked at the footman who was now walking all the way back to the sideboard to fetch a linen napkin. "This is absurd," Maud said quietly. Geoffrey set his letters down. "It is the established breakfast order. The order," Maud said, "serves an empty chair better than the people eating. The footmen are walking miles before noon simply to preserve a distance between 2 people who could easily share a smaller table." Geoffrey frowned. "The routine ensures punctuality." "The routine ensures exhaustion," Maud corrected. She did not raise her voice. She did not complain about being lonely at the far end of the table. She targeted the inefficiency. "I will take my breakfast in the East Room tomorrow. If you wish to eat across a vast distance, you may remain here." Geoffrey looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. He looked at the footman, who was currently attempting to pour tea without disturbing the perfect symmetry of the silver pieces. "Very well," Geoffrey said. "We will use the East Room. The bell will ring at 7. The next morning breakfast was served in the East Room on a smaller round table. The footman withdrew after pouring the tea. Geoffrey sat near the window. Maud sat across from him. The heavy silver bell did not ring. Geoffrey had ordered it silenced on ordinary mornings. The quiet where the bell should have been made, Maud looked up once. Geoffrey was already reading his letters, as if changing a ducal routine after a sound argument required no ceremony. The footmen walked half the distance they had walked the day before. That was enough. By the third week, the problem of the schoolroom required attention. Maud's younger brother Thomas had arrived from the Talbot relations. He was 9, quiet and careful in the way of a child who had learned to make himself small in other people's houses. Maud found Thomas sitting in the corner of the library, reading a book with his knees pulled up to his chest. "Why are you not in the schoolroom?" Maud asked. Thomas looked down. "Mr. Granville is giving a tour of the portrait gallery to some visiting cousins. The housekeeper said I should stay out of the corridors, so I do not crowd the guests." The meaning was plain. Thomas could use Penhallow until the real family needed the passage. Maud did not go in search of Mrs. Hale. She went to the schoolroom. The schoolroom was large, but the shelves were carefully marked with brass plaques detailing the charitable works of the late Duchess. The space felt like a museum exhibit, rather than a place for a child to learn. Geoffrey found her there an hour later. Maud was methodically removing the heavy unread instructional volumes from the lower shelves and replacing them with Thomas's own battered history books. "What is the defect with this room?" Geoffrey asked. He saw her moving the books. "I will have a permanent tutor's suite prepared in the south wing immediately. He does not need to use the charity shelves." "No," Maud said. She did not stop working. "A new suite is a gift that can be revoked. This room already exists." "Then why are you altering it?" Geoffrey asked. "Because Thomas was told to hide in the library to avoid your cousins," Maud said. "He does not need a grander room. He needs the room nobody can reclaim on visiting day. He needs an ordinary, predictable place." Geoffrey went still. His gaze moved from Thomas's battered books to the brass labels on the shelves. "I will speak to Mrs. Hale," Geoffrey said. "Your brother's access to this room and the corridors leading to it will not be restricted by guests." "Thank you," Maud said. That afternoon, when another servant came to ask whether the schoolroom should be cleared for visiting children, Mrs. Hale sent him away with Geoffrey's answer. Master Thomas's lessons were not to be displaced for company. Maud slid the last book into place. Geoffrey remained by the door instead of renewing his offer of a grander room. That restraint warmed something in her. To Maud it meant he had understood security was not splendor. It was a place no visiting cousin could take back. In the 4th week, the heavy rains began trapping everyone indoors. Maud began using the winter garden. The glazed walk was filled with dormant rose standards and camellias. It was beautiful, but the staff treated it as a mausoleum. At the center of the glasshouse sat an ornate wrought-iron bench and a small iron chair positioned exactly as the first Duchess had left them. Maud did not touch the bench, but the iron chair was sitting in deep shadow. Maud dragged the chair 4 feet to the left, placing it directly in a patch of pale afternoon sunlight. She sat and read her book. When she left the chair in the sunlight. The next afternoon, Maud returned to the winter garden. The iron chair had been moved back into the shadow, aligned perfectly with the paving stones. Maud dragged it back to the sunlight. The legs scraped loudly against the wet stone. An hour later, Geoffrey walked through the winter garden. Maud watched him from the East Room window. Geoffrey saw the chair out of line. He stopped, frowned at the paving, and without hesitation moved it back into the shadow beside the bench. Maud walked down the stairs. She entered the winter garden just as Geoffrey was turning to leave. Maud walked straight to the chair. She grabbed the iron back and dragged it loudly across the stone, placing it squarely in the sunlight. Geoffrey stopped. He looked at the chair. He looked at Maud. "It is not aligned with the bench," Geoffrey pointed out. "It is aligned with the sun," Maud corrected. Geoffrey looked from the empty shadow to the chair in the light, then back to Maud. She expected annoyance at the broken line of the paving. Instead, his attention rested on her with a contained curiosity that felt far more personal, as if her refusal to obey a useless arrangement had become more interesting to him than the arrangement itself. Then the severe line of his mouth altered by the smallest degree. "Very well," Geoffrey said. He turned and walked away, leaving the chair exactly where she had moved it. The chair remained in the sunlight for the rest of the day. More tellingly, it was still there the next morning. Maud said nothing about it. Neither did Geoffrey. Their small argument had become a private joke, and the winter garden had become a place the living could use without insulting the dead. Then, in the 5th week, the memorial invitations arrived. Maud was sitting at her writing table in the East Room when Mrs. Hale brought in the heavy silver tray. On it lay a stack of thick, black-edged cards and a leather-bound folio containing the ceremonial seating order. "Mr. Granville sent these from London, Your Grace," Mrs. Hale said, keeping her eyes carefully averted. "His Grace signed the approval this morning before he rode out to the tenant farms." Maud thanked her and waited for the door to close. She opened the folio. It was the schedule for the anniversary observance of the late Duchess. Maud scanned the list. The plan included a formal dinner for 40 relations. Maud looked at the seating chart. The chair at the head of the state dining table was marked for the late Duchess. It was to remain empty, a symbol of enduring grief. Geoffrey was seated to the right of the empty chair. The Dowager Duchess and Anthony Granville were positioned to receive the guests. Maud traced her finger down the paper. She found her own name halfway down the table, seated among the minor visiting cousins. She was listed under family guests. Maud did not cry or fling the folio aside. The paper itself was enough. Geoffrey's signature stood black at the bottom of a page that removed her as hostess of her own house. For the first time since taking the East Room key, Maud wondered whether the new routines had been merely exceptions allowed until an older duty returned. Geoffrey returned late in the afternoon. His boots were muddy, and he looked tired. He found Maud standing by the window in the East Room. The leather folio was open on her desk. "You have seen the memorial schedule," Geoffrey said, wiping off his gloves. "Granville manages the invitations. It is a necessary family duty." Maud turned to face him. She had read the page twice before deciding what exactly was wrong. "I will honor the late Duchess, Geoffrey," Maud said. "I will not attend my own house as her visitor." Geoffrey stopped. "It is the traditional seating. It is what we did last year. Last year you did not have a wife," Maud replied. She picked up the folio and held it out. "You asked me to enter this house as your wife, and then you signed an order that places a ghost at the head of the table and puts me among the minor cousins. The paper calls me a guest in my own household." Geoffrey looked at the paper, then at his own signature. His eyes moved once more to Maud's name halfway down the list. Maud watched the contradiction become visible to him. The man who had stopped another hand from occupying her signature line had signed an order that displaced her from her own table. He offered no defense. "Abbott!" Geoffrey shouted toward the corridor. A footman ran to fetch the solicitor. Mortimer appeared in the doorway a minute later, breathless. Geoffrey took the folio from Maud. He did not ask for a pen. He tore the seating chart in half. "Strike that order," Geoffrey commanded. The words were hard, absolute. "The error is mine. I did not read the placement before I signed." Mortimer stared at the torn paper. Your Grace, the invitations are already being prepared. Mr. Granville will adapt. Geoffrey interrupted. The memorial observance will be moved entirely to the chapel. There will be no state dinner centered around an empty chair. Her Grace hosts her own house. Every list, every invitation, every seating chart for any meal served in this building will place Maud, Duchess of Penhallow, at the head of the table. See to it. Mortimer bowed and hurried away. Less than an hour later, Mrs. Hale brought back the amended household sheet. The empty hostess's chair was gone from the state dining plan. Maud's name stood where the living hostess belonged. She read the line once, then folded the paper and returned it. Only then did she look at Geoffrey. He had broken a major family tradition and accepted the social cost of correcting his mistake. Anthony will be furious, Maud noted quietly. Several of your relatives may refuse to attend. Their absence is their choice, Geoffrey said. He looked directly at her. The responsibility for this house is mine. He offered no flowers and no excuse. He had withdrawn his own order in front of those who would resent the change, and he had accepted who might stay away. For Maud that counted for more than tenderness spoken too soon. The next day, the household waited to see what the new Duchess would do with the corrected order. Some of the staff seemed to expect the entire memorial to be cancelled, or the late Duchess's portrait removed from the gallery. Maud did neither. She took the inventory lists from Mrs. Hale. She kept the chapel flowers on the anniversary date. She left the portrait untouched in the gallery. She ordered the memorial suite dusted and maintained exactly as it had been. She only removed the empty chair ritual from the ordinary dining rooms. She did not erase the past. She simply drew a line where the past ended and the present began. That evening Maud stood in the East Room. The small table was set for supper. She looked at the brass key resting on her desk. She had chosen this room. She had defended her place in the house. Now she had to decide if she wanted the man who commanded it. She walked to the corridor and found one of Geoffrey's footmen. "Inform His Grace that supper will be served in the East Room at 7 o'clock, Maud said. "Tell him he is invited. It was a risk. She was inviting him into her chosen territory." At precisely 7 o'clock, the door opened. Geoffrey stepped inside. He came alone. He brought no paperwork, no valet, no family agenda. Maud stood by the small round table. She pointed to the chair beside hers rather than the one opposite. Geoffrey walked to the chair. He looked down. "It is 6 inches out of line with the table edge," Geoffrey noted. His voice was entirely dry. "You may survive it," Maud said. Geoffrey pulled the chair out. He sat down without adjusting it a single inch. The meal was quiet. The heavy silver bell did not ring. They did not discuss Anthony or the memorial. They spoke of the estate farms, the rain, and Thomas's lessons. When Geoffrey reached for the salt, his sleeve brushed Maud's. The chair he had refused to straighten was close enough that she felt the warmth of his arm through 2 layers of cloth. He did not move the chair away. Neither did she. No article required them to enjoy the meal, and that made the ordinary closeness feel more dangerous and more welcome than the formal wedding table had. His taste for exact order and her habit of quietly moving what did not serve began to feel less like opposition than a private language. The peace lasted 4 days. On the 5th afternoon, Anthony Granville arrived with a knot of Penhallow relations, including the dowager aunts who had stared at Maud on her wedding day. They had received the revised memorial instructions, and they had come to object. The confrontation happened in the gallery just before supper. Maud stood near the fireplace when Anthony approached, flanked by 3 aunts. Geoffrey was nearby, speaking with the steward. "This household has lost its discipline," Anthony announced loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear. He looked at Maud. "You have overstepped, madam. You are a temporary bride, a substitute for the sister who had the grace to understand the obligations of this family. We expect the original Talbot terms to be honored, and the memorial traditions to remain untouched. Maud felt the eyes of the room turn toward her. The insult was public, but the demand beneath it mattered more. Anthony wanted the right to tell her who she was in Geoffrey's house. Geoffrey turned. His face went hard. He took one step toward Anthony and opened his mouth. Maud knew that look now. An order of dismissal was coming. Maud raised her hand. She did not look at Geoffrey. She kept her eyes on Anthony. "Tomorrow morning," Maud said. Her voice cut through the tension with absolute clarity. "In the library. Bring the articles." Anthony looked taken aback by her calm. "The articles?" "Yes," Maud said. She turned to Geoffrey. If he expelled Anthony now, the insult would end on Geoffrey's terms. Maud wanted the articles and she wanted mourning. Geoffrey looked at her for one long beat. The order to dismiss Anthony never came. He closed his mouth and nodded once. "Tomorrow morning," Geoffrey echoed. He stepped back, leaving the time and place to her. Later that night, in the quiet of the East Room, Geoffrey stood by the window. "I could have him removed tonight," Geoffrey said. "I can draft a household ruling that bars him from the property." Maud sat at her writing table. She understood the offer. Geoffrey could end the quarrel for her before morning. But if he drafted the ruling, he would be doing exactly what Anthony had tried to do, deciding her identity for her. "No," Maud said. "I asked Mortimer to bring the signed copy of the articles." Geoffrey looked at her. "What do you need from me at the council?" Maud met his gaze. "When I finish," she said, "make it true in your house." The next morning, the library was tense. Anthony sat on a leather sofa with the dowager aunts. Geoffrey took a place by the fireplace, clear of Maud's chair and the table where the articles lay. Maud sat at the heavy mahogany table. Mortimer Abbott stood beside her. In front of her lay the marriage articles bound in the familiar cream ribbon. Anthony began immediately. "The intention of this marriage was a brief alliance. The elder sister was the intended bride. You, Maud, were unsupported. The one-season language proves your provisional status. We demand the original schedule of properties and ceremonial honors be restored to family control." Maud let him finish. The insults did not matter. Intention was not a signature. She reached out and untied the cream ribbon. The silk slid free with a soft whisper. She opened the parchment. She did not read the entire document. She turned directly to the final page. "Mr. Granville speaks of intention," Maud said. Her voice carried easily in the quiet room. "I speak of ink. This is my signature. I did not sign as a proxy for my sister. I signed for myself." She looked at Anthony. "You point to the one-season clause as proof that I am temporary. You assume the Duke required an escape from an orphan bride." Maud looked down at the paper, then back up. "The clause gives me the right after one season to choose whether I continue to reside at Penhallow. It does not make me less your Duchess. It makes my residence here a choice, not your escape." The aunts shifted uncomfortably. Anthony frowned. "That changes nothing of the family hierarchy. It changes what you may decide for me," Maud said. She closed the articles. "I will not permit any family instruction that calls me a replacement. I am the Duchess of Penhallow. I choose to remain at Penhallow through the agreed season. When it ends, whether I continue to make this house my residence will be my decision. You have no authority to revive my sister's arrangement or dictate my place here." She stopped speaking. She looked at Geoffrey. She had made her ruling. Geoffrey stepped forward. He did not restate her case. He did what Maud had asked the night before he made her ruling effective. "Abbott," Geoffrey said, his voice ringing with absolute command. "Record the following. Anthony Granville's countersign authority on all estate accounts is permanently revoked. No relative may alter a room, a hosting schedule, or a ceremonial order without her Grace's explicit written assent. All household records will read Maud, Duchess of Penhallow." Anthony stood up, his face red. "Geoffrey, if you do this, half the family will withdraw from your social affairs. You will isolate the estate. The consequence belongs to me, Geoffrey said coldly, because the order is mine to enforce. The council is concluded. Show yourselves out. No one answered at once. The aunts who had stared at Maud on her wedding day looked away first. Anthony had predicted that Geoffrey would regret the orphan bride. Instead, Anthony and his allies had spent their own influence trying to prove she did not belong. Geoffrey had not regretted Maud. He had revoked their privileges instead. The relatives filed out in silence. The heavy library door closed behind them. Geoffrey looked at Maud. There was no triumph in his face. He had used his rank only after she had finished speaking exactly as she had asked the night before. Maud picked up the brass key to the east room and slipped it into her pocket. The relatives were gone. What remained was the household she had chosen to inhabit and the man she had begun to invite into it. Supper will be in the east room at 7:30, Maud said. Geoffrey looked at her. The household schedule says 8. Maud allowed a very slight, dry smile to touch her lips. I have discovered schedules can be amended. Geoffrey held her gaze. For once, he did not correct the hour. He followed her out of the library. One season later, the date named in the residence clause arrived. Nothing in the house announced it. No bell rang differently, and no carriage waited at the door. Morning light reached the east room as it had the day before. Maud stood before her writing table. Her books were where she used them. The brass key lay beside her blotter. Her travelling writing case sat open empty except for a folded cloth. Geoffrey had not once asked her to surrender the residence choice early. He had also said nothing about the date now that it had come. For several minutes that silence acquired the wrong meaning. Geoffrey was exact in everything. Perhaps his refusal to ask her to stay was not confidence, but courtesy. His orderly way of leaving the door open if she wished to go. Maud placed one pen inside the travelling case and felt an unwelcome tightness beneath her ribs. It was possible, she thought, to respect a choice so scrupulously that the other person could not tell whether he hoped for either answer. Then she stopped. Geoffrey had kept the promise he had made on their wedding day. The decision would be hers. If Maud wanted a different answer from silence, she would have to give one. She took the pen back out and closed the travelling case. Thomas's lessons were proceeding in the schoolroom. Geoffrey was out on the estate farms. There was no new contract waiting on her desk, no order instructing her to remain, and no carriage ordered in expectation that she would leave. That evening, the servants came to set the small, round table in the east room for supper. Maud watched them lay out the silver. Before they finished, Maud walked over to the wall. She picked up a heavy wooden dining chair. She carried it herself, her silk skirts rustling, and placed it directly beside her own chair at the table. She did not wait for a servant to assign Geoffrey's place. She added him to her table by her own hand. Geoffrey entered the room 10 minutes later. He wore a dark coat, his face slightly wind-burned from the ride. He stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at the chair she had moved. It is not aligned with the edge of the table, Geoffrey noted. It is where I want it. Maud replied. Geoffrey's eyes lifted to hers. For one brief moment, the dry correction vanished from his face. He understood. Then he walked to the table. He did not adjust the chair. He sat down exactly where she had placed him. The contrast between them remained, but it no longer felt like a negotiation. It felt like home. Thomas ran into the room a moment later carrying a book. He took his seat at the table. As the first course was served, Geoffrey reached for his water glass. He set it down an inch outside the invisible symmetry of his usual placement. Maud reached out and calmly slid the glass 1 inch back to the left. Geoffrey looked at the glass. He made a dry observation. Household discipline is entirely collapsing. Maud did not smile, but her eyes were warm. She reached across the small space and placed her hand briefly over his. He turned his palm and laced his fingers through hers. Thomas looked up from his plate. Is His Grace losing the argument? Repeatedly, Geoffrey answered. Maud kept her hand over his. The brass key rested securely in her pocket. The old cream ribbon was packed away in a drawer, no longer binding a decision that others controlled. The room was hers. The choice was hers. And as the evening deepened into quiet, shared laughter, the Duke of Penhallow sat exactly where his Duchess had chosen to place him, the end.